I was 24 when I bought my first house. A small but cozy two-bedroom place with peeling paint, a stubborn front gate, and a yard that desperately needed mowing. To anyone else, it probably just looked like an average starter home, but to me, it was the culmination of nearly a decade of grinding. Since I was 16, I'd been supporting myself, 2 jobs through high school, odd hours, skipped parties, skipped vacations. My friends were posting photos from summer trips while I was working night shifts at the gas station, stocking shelves until 3 a.m. I never asked my parents for a cent. Not for rent, not for college, not for gas money. In fact, they rarely offered, and I stopped expecting it. I figured if I wanted a future, I'd have to build it myself. I thought, naively, that my parents would be proud. I didn't expect a parade, but maybe a, "Hey, good job, son." What I got instead was silence, and then the barbecue. The infamous family barbecue. It was supposed to be a celebration, just a casual weekend gathering with cousins, burgers, and beer. I drove over early because Mom asked if I could help set up tables. I thought that was her way of extending an olive branch, a sign that we were finally past the weird, cold distance that had been growing between us ever since I moved out at 18. Instead, it was like stepping into a pressure cooker. The first red flag was my younger brother, Dean, lounging on the patio like he owned the place. He's 22, still living at home, no job, no plans, and for reasons I will never understand, my parents treat him like he's made of glass. He barely glanced at me when I walked in, just smirked and went back to scrolling his phone. I shrugged it off and started hauling chairs into the yard. Half an hour later, everyone arrived, and the whole family was milling around with drinks in hand when Mom suddenly clapped for attention. "Everyone," she said, with this weird little smile, "Cody's here. And apparently he thinks he's better than the rest of us because he bought a house." I swear the world tilted a little. The cousins laughed, but it was that awkward laugh people do when they're not sure if it's a joke. I stood there holding a tray of plates, heat crawling up the back of my neck. Thanks," I said, trying to keep it light. Dad wasn't joking, though. He took a swig of beer and said, loud enough for the whole yard to hear, "Must be nice to play landlord while your brother can't even get ahead. Some of us actually care about family." That one stung. I wasn't even sure what he meant. I'd never once said no when they asked for small favors. Last month, I even lent Dean my car for a week when his broke down. I tried to keep it together. I sat down with a paper plate of food, hoping the moment would pass, but Mom wasn't done. She started telling everyone how unfair it was that I had a house while Dean was struggling to find his footing. She left out the part where Dean had turned down 3 job interviews because he didn't feel like working retail. Then, right as everyone was about to dig in, she turned to me, pointed across the table, and said, "You stole your brother's future." It was like getting slapped in front of the whole family. I put my fork down, my appetite gone. "Excuse me?" I asked. She crossed her arms, looking like she'd just delivered some kind of final verdict. "You bought that house before Dean had a chance. Now the market's impossible, and you locked him out. How's he supposed to start a life when you took the opportunity first?" I honestly thought I misheard her. The house I bought was a foreclosure I'd been saving for since I was 17. It had nothing to do with Dean. But no one said a word. Not Dad, not my cousins, not even my aunt who usually loves drama. Everyone just stared at me like they were waiting to see what I'd do. I left early. I didn't slam doors, didn't yell. I just stood up, thanked them for dinner, and drove home with my chest tight and my jaw aching from clenching it. That night, I sat in my empty living room. No furniture yet, just boxes and a folding chair, and I couldn't shake the humiliation. I replayed Mom's words over and over. Stole his future. Like buying something with my own money was theft. Like I owed Dean something. For the first time, I felt angry. Not just at them, but at myself, for always trying to be the good son. For thinking that if I just worked hard enough, they'd respect me. Then came the kicker. A week later, I heard a knock at my door. It was a process server. I laughed at first because I thought it was a mistake, until I saw the envelope. My parents were suing me. The claim? Intentional interference with Dean's economic prospects. I had to read it 3 times before it sank in. They were literally blaming me, in court, for buying a house before Dean could. And that's when something in me shifted. The anger turned into something sharper, colder. This wasn't just a family argument anymore. This was war. The lawsuit hit me harder than I expected, not just because it was absurd, but because it was a line I never thought my own parents would cross. I had always known they favored Dean, but I had convinced myself it was just a little brother thing. The kid gloves treatment, the extra dessert slices at dinner, the new sneakers when mine had to last an extra year. I thought once we were all adults, we'd finally be on equal footing. But that envelope was proof that we weren't even in the same arena. The next day, I drove to my parents' house. Not because I wanted to yell, I just needed answers. Mom opened the door like nothing had happened. "Oh, good. You're here," she said, stepping aside as though we were meeting for coffee. I held up the envelope. "You sued me." She didn't even flinch. "You forced our hand, Cody. You left us no choice." No choice. I could feel my voice rising, so I forced it down. "Mom, this is insane. You're trying to take me to court because I bought a house with my own money." Dad walked in from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel like he'd been waiting for this moment. "You knew your brother was planning to move out," he said. "You scooped up a house before he could, knowing it would crush him." I blinked. What house was Dean going to buy? He doesn't even have a job. "Not yet," Dad said, like that solved anything. "But we were going to help him with a down payment. You ruined that plan by buying in the same neighborhood." I stared at them, speechless. "So, let me get this straight. You were going to buy Dean a house, but now you can't because you think there aren't enough houses to go around." Mom crossed her arms. "It's about fairness, Cody. You don't need a house yet. You could have waited. You should have waited. But you just had to rub it in our faces." That one made me laugh. "Rub it in your faces?" "Mom, I didn't even tell you until after the closing. I thought maybe you'd be proud of me." She gave me this pitying look, the kind you give a child who just doesn't understand. "We would be proud if you thought about someone other than yourself for once." Something in me cracked at that moment. I realized nothing I said was going to matter. They had already decided I was the villain of this story. I left before I said something I couldn't take back. But walking away didn't make it better. Over the next few weeks, it felt like my entire family turned into a PR machine for Dean. My aunt called to say I should do the right thing and sign over the house to my brother, since he needed it more. My cousin texted me a link to some article about housing inequality with a little thumbs up emoji, as if that somehow proved I was hoarding resources. Even my grandma, who usually stayed out of drama, called me late one night to tell me she was disappointed in me for putting myself before family. Dean, of course, loved the attention. He started posting cryptic things on social media, stuff like, "Some people don't care if you sink, as long as they swim," and "Imagine taking what was meant for someone else." His friends piled on in the comments, turning me into the villain in a story I hadn't agreed to be part of. The worst was the next family dinner. I almost didn't go, but a part of me still hoped maybe they'd calm down. Maybe this would blow over. It didn't. As soon as I walked in, I felt the air change. Dean was sitting at the head of the table, my dad's seat, holding court like he was king of the world. He smirked when he saw me. "Oh, look," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The homewrecker's here." I tried to ignore him and sat down quietly, but Mom wouldn't let it slide. "You know, Cody, we're giving you a chance to make this right before things get ugly. If you just sell the house and split the profit with your brother, we can drop the lawsuit." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Drop the lawsuit?" I said. "You think I'm going to give up my house, because you decided Dean deserves it more?" Dad leaned forward, elbows on the table. "You wouldn't have been able to buy that place without all the lessons we taught you. Without the roof over your head while you worked those jobs. You owe us." I had to take a deep breath before I spoke, because every part of me wanted to yell. "I paid rent when I lived here," I said. "Remember that? I started giving you money every month when I was 16. You charged me for groceries. I didn't owe you anything then, and I sure as heck don't owe you now." That's when Dean decided to chime in. "You've always been jealous," he said, smirking. "You can't stand that Mom and Dad love me more. So you try to buy your way into being the golden child." I stared at him. "Dean, I don't want to be the golden child. I just wanted a house. That's it. You're the one turning this into a competition." He shrugged. "If you really cared about this family, you'd give me a chance to have what you have." That was when I realized it. They didn't see me as part of the family anymore. I was just a resource to be mined. A walking wallet who had the audacity to use his money on himself. When I got home that night, there was a voicemail from my mom. Her voice was icy, controlled. "If you don't cooperate, Cody, we will have no choice but to escalate. You think this is just a lawsuit, but we can make things very difficult for you." I sat there in my little living room, staring at the blank wall, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like their son. I felt like their enemy. And that's when the anxiety turned into something else. Not fear, not sadness, determination. If they wanted to fight, they were going to get one. I wasn't going to roll over this time. I wasn't going to be guilt-tripped or manipulated. But before I could act, things got worse, much worse. Because a few days later, I woke up to a letter from my bank. Someone had tried to access my account using my personal information. Someone with my mother's maiden name, my date of birth, and my social security number. And that's when I knew this wasn't just a family feud anymore. It was about to become all-out war. I didn't even have time to process the bank notice before the next punch landed. That same afternoon, while I was at work, I got a call from my insurance company. They were verifying that I wanted to cancel my homeowner's policy. My heart dropped. I hadn't called them. I told them not to cancel anything and asked for details. Apparently, someone had called pretending to be me, gave them my policy number, my address, even answered my security question correctly. The question was mother's maiden name. By the time I hung up, my hands were shaking. This was no longer paranoia. This was deliberate sabotage. I called the bank to make sure my account was frozen and set up extra security. They confirmed there had been 2 attempts to access my online banking, both from the same IP address, which they gave me. I'm not a hacker, but I know how to plug an IP into a lookup tool. It was my parents' internet provider. I felt like the room was closing in. They weren't just suing me. They were actively trying to ruin me. And the worst part? They had the information to do it. Who else but family would know your first pet's name, the street you grew up on, or the make and model of your first car? I tried to give them one last chance to explain. Maybe it was some coincidence. Maybe Dean had a friend who thought this was funny. I drove over there that evening, clutching the printed email from the bank like evidence in a trial. The house was quiet except for the sound of the TV. Mom was on the couch, knitting. Dad was in his recliner. Dean was sprawled across the love seat with a bowl of chips. "Did you try to hack into my bank account?" I asked, holding up the paper. Dad muted the TV, but didn't look concerned. "Watch your tone, son." "I'm serious," I said. "Did you?" "Because this IP address traces back here." Dean smirked. "So? Maybe you should have better passwords." That was all I needed to hear. "You did this," I said, turning to him fully. "You tried to break into my account." He shrugged like it was no big deal. "I just wanted to see how much you had. Thought maybe you'd have enough to do the right thing and help out." I stared at him, stunned. "You don't get to help yourself to my bank account because you think you deserve something. That's illegal." Mom put down her knitting. "Don't be dramatic, Cody. He's your brother. Families share things. Families don't steal from each other." I shouted before I could stop myself. Dad stood up, towering over me like he used to when I was a teenager. "Lower your voice. We won't have you disrespecting us in our own house." "You're suing me," I said, my voice cracking. "You tried to cancel my insurance. You tried to hack my bank account. And you're worried about respect?" Mom's face hardened. "We had no choice, Cody. You wouldn't listen. You forced us to take action." That was the moment something inside me snapped. I realized there was no line they wouldn't cross. If they were willing to break the law, ruin my credit, maybe even get me foreclosed on just to teach me a lesson, then I couldn't keep playing nice. I left without another word, but the next week proved they weren't finished. I started getting weird calls from utilities, asking if I really wanted my water and power shut off. Someone had put in cancellation requests for every service tied to my house. The gas company even sent someone out to confirm the disconnection. I stopped them just in time. It was exhausting. Every day was a new fire to put out, literally. At one point, someone reported a gas leak at my address and the fire department showed up, pounding on my door at 3 a.m. I stood there half asleep while my neighbors watched from their porches, whispering. I finally installed cameras around the property, and that's when I got my proof. One night, the motion alert pinged my phone, and I opened the feed to see Dean, hoodie pulled up, walking right up to my porch. He bent down and yanked my for sale sign out of the yard, the one I had put up weeks earlier just to scare them into thinking I might move. He didn't notice the camera until after he flipped it the middle finger and walked off. The next morning, I printed the footage and took it straight to the police. I didn't want to escalate, but this was too far. They filed a report and told me to consider a restraining order. I hadn't wanted to go that route. He was still my brother, but after weeks of psychological warfare, I didn't have much of a choice. The next family dinner invitation never came, which suited me just fine. But that didn't stop them from showing up unannounced. 2 nights later, I was sitting on my couch, watching TV, when there was a loud banging at my door. When I opened it, Mom and Dad were standing there, furious. "Why did you call the police on your brother?" Mom demanded before I could even say hello. "Because he trespassed on my property," I said, keeping my voice calm. Dad's face turned red. "You're trying to destroy this family. You're dragging us through the mud." "You did that yourselves," I said, my hands trembling but steadying on the doorknob. "You sued me. You hacked me. You tried to shut off my water. I'm done being the bad guy just because you say so." Mom's voice went cold. "If you go through with that restraining order, Cody, you won't have a family left." I stared at her for a long moment, then said the quiet part out loud. "I don't think I do anymore." I shut the door before they could respond, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't just a metaphorical statement. In that moment, I realized I'd crossed a line too. I was done trying to win their approval. Done playing the role of the responsible son who keeps the peace. But even with all that, the worst betrayal was still coming. And when it landed, it would change everything. Because a week later, I got a letter from my employer's HR department saying they had received an anonymous complaint about me, claiming I was committing fraud, embezzling money, and unfit to represent the company. And I didn't even need to guess who had sent it. When I read that HR letter, my stomach dropped so hard it felt like the floor gave way under me. Fraud? Embezzlement? I sat there staring at the words as if reading them enough times would somehow make them mean something else. I had worked at that company for 3 years. I was the guy who stayed late to finish projects, covered for people when they called in sick, never complained about overtime. And now, thanks to an anonymous complaint, they were investigating me like I was some kind of criminal. The next day, I had to sit through a humiliating meeting with HR and my manager, going over every transaction I'd signed off on in the last 12 months. My hands were clammy, my throat dry, even though I knew I had done nothing wrong. It didn't matter. The stain of suspicion was there now. They put me on administrative leave pending investigation, which was just corporate speak for "we don't trust you until we're sure." I drove home numb, the whole world buzzing in my ears. Losing my job would mean losing my income, which meant my house would be on the line. And deep down, I knew that was exactly what my parents wanted, to break me down until I had no choice but to come crawling back, willing to do whatever they said just to survive. The next few weeks were a blur. Every day felt like walking through wet cement. Heavy, slow, exhausting. I spent hours gathering documents for HR, bank statements, pay stubs, anything to prove my innocence. At the same time, I was still dealing with the lawsuit. The court date was looming, and my attorney, the cheapest I could find, warned me it was going to get ugly. The stress started to show. I stopped sleeping more than a few hours a night, waking up at 3 a.m. with my mind racing. My appetite disappeared. My friends noticed I was pulling away, but I didn't know how to explain it without sounding like a crazy person. "My family is suing me and trying to ruin my life" isn't exactly casual conversation. And then came the final blow. The mortgage company called. Because of the lawsuit and the HR investigation, my credit score had dropped enough that they were reviewing my loan. They weren't calling it foreclosure yet, but I could hear the warning in their tone. If anything else went wrong, I could lose the house I'd spent nearly a decade working toward. That night, I sat in the middle of my empty living room floor. Still no furniture, just boxes I hadn't unpacked because I didn't know if I'd even get to keep this place. And for the first time in years, I felt completely defeated. I thought about all the nights I'd worked back-to-back shifts, coming home too tired to do anything but collapse on my mattress. I thought about the vacations I skipped, the things I sold just to make rent, the way I'd clawed my way up from nothing. And now it all felt like it could vanish because my family had decided I stole something I had earned. I don't know how long I sat there, just staring at the wall, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. Long enough for the anger to drain out of me, replaced by something quieter, heavier. Not despair exactly, more like resolve. Because here's the thing, I've been here before. Not this exact situation, but this feeling. The bottom of the barrel, the point where you either break or you build something new. I remembered being 16, sitting in my room with a backpack full of clothes, knowing my parents weren't going to help me and I had to figure it out alone. I remembered that feeling, and I remembered that I had survived. So that night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to sell my house or give Dean a dime. And I wasn't going to let them break me, even if I had to crawl through every single obstacle they threw in my way. The first thing I did was hire a better lawyer. I sold my old car to pay the retainer and picked up a cheap used one just to get to work. My new attorney actually listened, went through the case with me, and started building a strategy instead of just telling me to settle. Then I got serious about my security. I froze my credit, changed every password, put two-factor authentication on everything from my bank to my Netflix account. I installed a better camera system around the house, one with cloud storage so nothing could mysteriously disappear if someone tampered with it. I also started documenting everything, every call, every letter, every weird attempt to mess with my life. I bought a binder and filled it with notes, screenshots, copies of police reports. I even logged the times Dean or my parents drove past my house, just in case. At work, I stayed polite and professional during the investigation, but inside, I was fuming. I started digging quietly, asking HR questions about the complaint, looking for any clue that might prove where it came from. They couldn't give me much, but they did slip up once and mentioned the caller had mentioned my family feud. That was all the confirmation I needed. The hardest part was staying quiet. Every bone in my body wanted to go online and blast the truth, post the security footage, tell everyone what my family was really like. But I didn't. Not yet. I kept my head down, kept building my case, waiting. Because I knew something they didn't. That as much as they had tried to push me into a corner, they had left a trail. And eventually, I was going to use that trail to bury them. But before I could do that, I had to survive the worst blow of all. The court date was coming up, and I knew my parents weren't going to play fair. And sure enough, a week before the hearing, I got a package in the mail. Inside was a stack of printed screenshots, texts I had sent Dean years ago, completely out of context, carefully edited to make me look like I was threatening him. And right there, on top of the stack, was a handwritten note in my mother's neat script. This is what happens when you turn your back on your family. When I held that note in my hands, something shifted. It wasn't fear this time, it was clarity. I finally understood exactly who I was dealing with. My parents weren't just angry or disappointed or even petty. They were willing to burn everything down. Me, my job, my reputation, just to prove that they still controlled the narrative. And for the first time in months, I felt a strange kind of calm wash over me. Because when you realize the other side is willing to play dirty, you stop wasting energy trying to be the better person and start focusing on winning. The next morning, I called my lawyer and handed over the package. He flipped through the pages, his brows rising higher with every sheet. "This is good," he said. I blinked. "Good. It's fabricated," he said, holding up one of the screenshots. "See here? The timestamps don't line up. And this one? You didn't even have this phone number 3 years ago. This is going to make them look very, very bad in front of a judge." For the first time since this whole mess started, I actually smiled. That moment lit a fire under me. I doubled down on gathering evidence. I pulled my phone records, my bank statements, even got an affidavit from a friend who'd been there when some of those supposed threats were sent. My lawyer compiled everything into a neat, damning little portfolio. At the same time, things at work started turning around. HR finished their investigation and cleared me completely. In fact, they found the anonymous complaint so baseless and malicious that they flagged it as harassment and passed the information to legal. My manager called me personally to tell me I could come back. Walking back into that office after weeks of leave was surreal. People had clearly heard about the drama. I caught more than one coworker sneaking glances, but I held my head high. My manager actually offered me a new project, something bigger than anything I'd worked on before. "You've been through a lot," she said. "But we know what kind of employee you are. We trust you." Those words hit me harder than I expected. After months of being treated like a villain, it felt good to be seen for who I really was. I threw myself into the work, stayed late, voluntarily this time, and by the end of the quarter, I not only finished the project but exceeded every metric. Then came the kicker. I got a raise. A big one. It wasn't just about the money, though I won't lie, that part felt amazing. It was about taking back control of my life. For months, I had been reacting to everything my parents threw at me. Now, finally, I was building something again. I also started making changes at home. I unpacked the boxes that had been sitting in the living room for months, finally putting pictures on the walls. I mowed the yard, fixed the broken gate, even planted a little vegetable garden in the back. My house stopped feeling like a target and started feeling like what it was supposed to be, mine. Socially, I started letting people back in. I had dinner with friends, invited a few over for a small housewarming. It felt good to laugh again without checking my phone every 5 minutes, waiting for the next disaster to drop. But just because I was healing didn't mean I'd forgotten. In fact, I was planning. Quietly, carefully, patiently. I started digging into public records, property deeds, tax filings, even court documents. And that's when I found something interesting. My parents weren't as financially stable as they pretended to be. They had taken out a second mortgage on their house 2 years ago, and judging by the liens attached, they were behind on payments. Suddenly, their obsession with my house made a lot more sense. They weren't just angry that I had succeeded, they were desperate. I didn't rush to act on this information. Instead, I tucked it away, adding it to the binder with the rest of my evidence. If they wanted to paint me as the villain, fine. I'd play the part, but on my own terms. A week before the court date, my lawyer scheduled a deposition with them. I sat quietly as he questioned them, calm and professional, while Mom tried to maintain her righteous fury. But the cracks were showing. Every time they brought up Dean's future, my lawyer calmly pointed out that Dean had no job, no savings, and no concrete plan to purchase a house, and that my purchase had no bearing on his ability to buy one later. Then he pulled out the forged screenshots. "Can you confirm these are authentic?" he asked. Mom hesitated just a fraction of a second too long. "Yes," she said finally. "Interesting," my lawyer said, flipping to the next page. "Because our expert analysis shows these were created on a phone that belongs to your younger son, Dean. Would you like to revise your answer?" I'll never forget the look on her face. For once, she didn't have a snappy reply. After the deposition, my lawyer turned to me with a grin. "They're going to regret ever filing this lawsuit." I could feel it too, the shift in power. For the first time in this entire ordeal, I wasn't the one on the defensive. And as the court date crept closer, I felt something else rising in me. Not just confidence, but something sharper. They had humiliated me, sabotaged me, tried to destroy my career. They had crossed every line imaginable and then acted shocked when I fought back. I wasn't just going to win this case. I was going to make sure they thought twice before ever coming after me again. And the perfect opportunity to do it was about to present itself, in the very same courtroom where they thought they'd see me broken. By the time the court date was set, I was no longer just defending myself. I was preparing an offensive strike. The deposition had been my first real taste of leverage, and I realized just how much power came from simply having the truth organized and ready to drop at the right moment. I spent the next several weeks turning my binder into a weapon. Every page was perfectly labeled, cross-referenced, tabbed. Evidence of the hacking attempt, printed with IP logs and a notarized statement from my internet provider confirming the trace. Proof of the false insurance cancellations, copies of the calls, dates, and times, plus the letters reversing them. Security footage of Dean trespassing, 3 different angles, synced together and burned onto a thumb drive. But the most devastating piece of evidence wasn't even about me. It came to me one night while I was doing my usual background digging. I was scrolling through county records when I found something I hadn't noticed before. My parents' names were listed on a pending foreclosure notice. At first, I thought it was a mistake. I drove to the county clerk's office to double-check, and sure enough, there it was. Their house, the house where we grew up, was weeks away from being auctioned if they didn't bring the mortgage current. And suddenly, everything clicked. Their rage at me buying a house wasn't just about favoritism or Dean's future. It was about fear. They were losing their house, their status, the one thing they'd always held over my head. "We put a roof over yours." And they couldn't stand the idea that I'd have a roof of my own while theirs was slipping through their fingers. I sat in my car in the clerk's parking lot for a long time, just staring at the document. A younger version of me might have felt pity, maybe even offered to help. But that version of me was gone. They had tried to ruin me, to strip me of everything I'd built. If they wanted a fight, I was going to give them one. I called my lawyer that night and told him what I'd found. "Interesting leverage," he said, in that calm way lawyers do when they know exactly how to use a piece of information. "If they keep pushing this, we can subpoena their financials. Once those foreclosure notices become part of the public record in court, it's going to be hard for them to keep playing the righteous parents act." The timing couldn't have been better. My HR department had not only cleared me, but offered to write a formal letter attesting to my good character and excellent performance. My boss even volunteered to appear in court if needed to testify that the complaint was baseless and likely malicious. In other words, I had credibility. They didn't. But I wasn't content to just let the court hearing be the end of it. Quietly, I started lining up things they didn't even know were coming. I met with my bank and got pre-approved for a line of credit. I started speaking with a real estate attorney, not because I planned to sell my house, but because I wanted to be prepared if they tried to file a lien or pull some last-minute stunt. And perhaps most importantly, I started talking to people in the family, not to beg, not to explain myself, but to let them know what was really going on. I showed my aunt the forged text messages, the police report from Dean's trespassing, even the letter from HR. Watching her face change from smug judgment to quiet shock was deeply satisfying. Word spread fast after that. Cousins who had once been cold toward me started reaching out with neutral texts, the kind that say, "We're not sure what's happening, but we don't want to be on the wrong side of it." Dean, meanwhile, had no idea the tide was turning. He still strutted around on social media, posting cryptic digs about me, subtweeting about toxic siblings, even sharing GoFundMe links to raise money for his housing situation. He conveniently left out the part where he wasn't actually homeless, just mad that he didn't have a free house. Mom called me one last time the night before the hearing. Her tone was sugar-coated, which was always a bad sign. "Cody," she said, "there's still time to make this right. Just sign over the house, or at least sell it and give your brother the profit. Let's end this before it gets ugly." I couldn't help but laugh. "Mom," I said, "it's already ugly. And tomorrow, it's going to get public." There was a long pause on the line before she said, "You'll regret this." Maybe once upon a time, I would have. But now? Now I was ready. The morning of the court date, I put on the best suit I owned. Nothing flashy, but sharp enough to make a point. I printed 2 extra copies of the foreclosure notice and slipped them into my folder, right behind the forged screenshots. Not because I was sure we'd need them, but because I wanted to be ready if my lawyer gave me the nod. Walking into that courthouse was surreal. My parents were already there, sitting with Dean at their side. Mom looked smug, Dad looked angry, and Dean, well, Dean looked like he thought he was about to win the lottery. They didn't know that the game had already changed. Because this time, I wasn't coming in just to defend myself. I was coming in to win, and to make sure they never forgot it. And the judge hadn't even called the case, yet when the first cracks started to appear, my lawyer quietly handed their attorney a copy of the forensic analysis on the fake texts, along with a list of potential counterclaims we were prepared to file, including harassment, attempted fraud, and defamation. Their attorney's face went pale. For the first time in months, I felt like I was finally holding the cards. And the best part? I still had one more ace up my sleeve, the financial information that could blow their entire image apart in front of the whole family. I didn't plan to use it unless I had to. But if they pushed me, oh, I was more than ready. The courtroom was quiet except for the shuffle of papers and the occasional cough from the gallery. I sat straight-backed, my folder neatly in front of me, and for the first time since this entire nightmare started, I wasn't fighting nausea. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't second-guessing myself. The judge called our case, and we all rose. My parents and Dean moved to the plaintiff's table, and I took my place at the defense table beside my lawyer. Mom shot me a look that was meant to be intimidating. That same look she used to give me as a kid when I tracked mud into the kitchen, but this time it bounced right off me. Their attorney started with a speech that sounded rehearsed, about familial obligations and unfair economic sabotage. He tried to frame me as the selfish older brother who had deliberately purchased a property that prevented his younger sibling from establishing financial independence. The judge's eyebrows shot up at that. "Counselor," she said slowly, "you're telling me this is a case about buying a house first?" Their attorney stammered something about intent and equitable relief. I could see the frustration already setting in. The judge didn't look impressed. Then it was our turn. My lawyer stood, calm and methodical, and began dismantling their argument piece by piece. He presented my bank records showing years of savings, pay stubs from my 2 jobs during high school, documentation proving I paid rent to my parents while living at home. "This purchase," my lawyer said, gesturing to the closing documents, "was the result of nearly a decade of hard work. There is no evidence that my client interfered with the plaintiff's ability to buy a home. In fact, the plaintiff does not currently have employment, pre-approval, or savings that would allow him to make such a purchase. This lawsuit is not only baseless, it is malicious. Then came the good part, the exhibits we'd been saving. First, the security footage. Dean's face turned bright red as the video played, showing him trespassing on my property and yanking out my sign before flipping off the camera. The courtroom was silent except for a quiet gasp from somewhere in the back, probably my aunt. Then came the forged screenshots. My lawyer handed them to the judge, along with the forensic analysis. As you can see, Your Honor, these messages were fabricated in an attempt to paint my client as hostile and threatening. They were created on the plaintiff's personal device. The judge's expression hardened. "Plaintiff," she said, turning to Dean, "is this true?" Dean stammered something about jokes and memes, but the damage was done. The judge ordered the documents entered into the record as evidence of bad faith. And then, just when I thought we might be done, my lawyer slid one final document across the table. "Your Honor," he said, "we would also like to submit into evidence these public records, which show the plaintiffs are currently in default on their own mortgage and facing foreclosure proceedings. This is relevant as it establishes motive for their attempt to seize my client's property." It was like dropping a bomb in the room. Mom's face drained of color. Dad sat back in his chair, jaw clenched. Dean looked confused, like he hadn't even known. The judge leafed through the papers, then looked up at their attorney. "Counselor, is this accurate?" Their attorney hesitated before nodding. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge exhaled sharply and set the papers down. "In light of this new information, I am dismissing this case with prejudice." That meant they couldn't refile. I should have felt relief, and I did, but mostly what I felt was control returning to me, inch by inch. But I wasn't done yet. Because as we walked out of the courtroom, my lawyer reminded them, in front of everyone, that we were considering filing counterclaims for harassment, attempted fraud, and defamation. "My client has been put through significant financial and emotional stress as a result of your actions," he said smoothly. "We will be seeking damages." Mom's mouth opened like she was going to argue, but Dad put a hand on her arm, his face dark. I didn't say a word until we were outside. That's when I finally turned to them. "You wanted to take everything from me," I said quietly. "You wanted me broken. Instead, you lost, and everyone saw it. Next time you think about coming after me, remember how this ended." And then I walked away, leaving them standing on the courthouse steps. I got into my car and sat there for a minute, just breathing. For months, I'd felt like I was drowning. Now, for the first time, I felt like I had my head above water again. But I wasn't finished. Because if they thought the courtroom was the end of my revenge, they were about to learn otherwise. I went home and called my lawyer back. "Let's move forward with the counterclaim," I said. He smiled through the phone. "I was hoping you'd say that." What came next would not just clear my name. It would make sure my parents and Dean paid for every sleepless night, every sabotaged bill, every lie they'd spread about me. And it would be public. Filing the counterclaim felt like crossing a finish line I'd been running toward for months. This time, I wasn't reacting, I was in control. My lawyer filed claims for harassment, defamation, and attempted fraud, backed by every piece of evidence we had meticulously collected. The forged screenshots, the IP logs, the security footage, even the letters from my job confirming the false complaint had put me on unpaid leave. The response from my parents came a week later, and it was almost laughable. Suddenly, they were singing a different tune. The same people who had stormed into court demanding my house were now sending carefully worded letters asking to resolve this amicably and keep the matter within the family. My lawyer told me it was a good sign. It meant they were scared. And they should have been. When the case finally went to mediation, I walked into the conference room with my lawyer, calm and collected. My parents were already there, looking worn down. Mom's face was pale, and Dad looked like he hadn't slept in days. Dean, for once, wasn't smirking. He was fidgeting with the zipper of his hoodie like a kid waiting outside the principal's office. The mediator went over the claims, outlining just how bad things could get for them if this went to trial. Dean's little stunt with the fake screenshots alone could have resulted in criminal charges if I'd chosen to pursue them. And the hacking attempt? The police report was already on file. We could have handed it over to the district attorney if we wanted. At one point, Mom tried to appeal to me directly. "Cody," she said, her voice trembling, "you're really going to drag your own family through this?" were your parents. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. You dragged me through this. You started this. And now you don't get to cry foul because you lost. In the end, they had no choice but to settle. The agreement was clear. They would drop any future claims against me, issue a formal written apology, which my lawyer made sure was legally enforceable, and pay restitution for the legal fees and damages I had incurred. When I signed the papers, I felt lighter than I had in months. But the fallout didn't stop there. Word of the settlement spread quickly through the family. Suddenly, all those cousins who had mocked me behind my back were texting me to say they had no idea it was that bad, and were just going along with what they were told. My aunt, the same one who had called to guilt-trip me months earlier, showed up at my door with a pie and an apology. As for my parents, the foreclosure on their house went through a few months later. They had been too busy burning bridges with me to save their own sinking ship. Dean moved into a cheap apartment on the edge of town, and from what I heard, he was still trying to find steady work. I didn't go to the foreclosure auction. I didn't need to. Instead, a few weeks after the case was officially closed, I hosted a housewarming party. It wasn't fancy, just some friends, neighbors, and a few of the cousins who had stayed neutral through everything. But it felt like the closing of a chapter. At one point during the evening, as the sun was setting, I stood in my backyard looking at the little vegetable garden I'd planted months earlier. It had grown in nicely, green and full of life, a quiet reminder of everything I had fought for. And then my phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. It was my mom. All we ever wanted was for you to be part of this family, she wrote. I stared at it for a while before typing back. I was part of this family, until you decided I wasn't. Then I set my phone down, turned back to my guests, and raised a glass. To new beginnings, I said. They cheered, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I believed it. That night, as I locked the front door and turned off the lights, I paused in the hallway, listening to the quiet of my house. No footsteps from upstairs, no doors slamming, no voices telling me what I owed. Just peace. And standing there, I realized that in a way, my parents had given me exactly what I needed. Not their approval, not their help, but the freedom to stop trying to earn either one. The war was over, and I had won.